never been cut out for camping. The dust, the bugs, those vaguely cold nights in a sleeping bag that somehow leave your back aching like you spent the night on a hidden rock. Pure torture to me. The bad part is, I've camped more times than I care to count, and almost never by choice. My dad is the tough, outdoors worshiping type. Every summer when I was a kid, he'd drag me into the woods with a pack of equally tough friends to disconnect from phones and reconnect with nature. By sophomore year of high school, I'd had enough. I begged until my voice went hoarse, and he finally relented a bit. He'd let me invite a friend along to make it less miserable. I picked Mason, a classmate. On paper, it sounded like asking for trouble. Mason used to be a hardcore Boy Scout and loves camping. But he wasn't the type to preach that real men have to love the woods. He'd rib me for hating camping, but knew when to stop. I also figured if I had to suffer, I might as well suffer with someone who could start a fire and pitch a tent without turning it into a disaster. Plus, back then Mason would grab any excuse to get away from his parents. So the moment I asked, he lit up. The trip went offbeat from the start. One of my dad's friends messed up the reservation, and instead of a truly remote, pine-scented wilderness, we landed at Cedar Hollow, a campsite urbanized to a ridiculous degree. Fully built bathrooms, perfectly straight asphalt access roads, even a kid's playground with swings and a slide. That wasn't camping. That was glamping. Backyard deluxe. My dad was too angry to speak, and all I could do was swallow a sigh. The worst part sat just beyond a fence, a mini amusement park. I'm not kidding. A glittering Ferris wheel, a roller coaster rising and falling like a dragon's spine, the smell of popcorn drifting on the wind. Two settings that should never mix, woodsy camping and neon park, were standing side by side, looking both absurd and surreal. The mood turned sour. My dad and his buddy muttered nonstop, "This isn't camping." Mason said the same thing, over and over to the point of irritation, as if my family needed enlightening. I snapped at him to cut it out, and he did, immediately. We'd driven for hours to get there. We couldn't just turn around because the vibe was off. So the only option left was to make the best of it. The adults scowled a little longer, then got to work setting up. Mason sprang into action like he'd been waiting to show off. In minutes, our tent was up with tidy knots, a rainfly pulled taut, stakes in a perfect line, like an illustration in a manual. My dad, who rarely praises anyone without a little blood or fainting involved, nodded, and I felt both relieved and, well, a little jealous. Mason and I shared a tent. After dinner and a few chores, we vanished from the grown-ups with the excuse of organizing our stuff. In truth, Mason had a metal pipe and a bit of weed stashed in an Altoids tin. Not much, just enough to take the edge off. Back then, we both had a streak of mischief, liked to hang around where we didn't belong and do things we shouldn't. I've quit all that now, and sometimes I wonder if I just wanted to be different, to defy the house rules. I didn't think that far back then. We slipped behind a stand of pines and took a few hits, snickering as we went, not worrying about the smell, since we planned to avoid the adults for the rest of the night anyway. Back at the tent, we shot the breeze about school. Neither of us had the energy to sleep. Mason glanced over with a sly grin, and I knew instantly what he meant. Go exploring. I hesitated at first. There was nothing about this campsite worth exploring. Then I realized he meant the amusement park. Instantly, my reluctance gave way to a hot, reckless excitement. Mason said climbing to the top of a roller coaster would probably be easy as pie. We were into climbing back then. The thought of standing on the peak of a steel mountain and looking down at a field of lights sounded like the cleanest hit of adrenaline imaginable. We waited until the campground sank into stillness, then made our move. Past midnight, the wind tiptoed through the treetops. We each took a flashlight and followed the edge of the chain-link fence around the park. We found an easy spot to climb. Mason boosted me, then I hauled him over. Inside, it was pitch black, but there were guards making rounds. Now and then the whir of a golf cart drifted over. It felt like sneaking through a game. Every blind corner, a checkpoint. Every open stretch, a gamble. We pressed ourselves behind kiosks, slipped between the shadows of structures, timed our dashes to the sweep of flashlight beams. Once or twice, we had to sprint across open ground the instant a guard's brimmed hat tilted our way. My throat was tight with nerves, but I was buzzing too. That hazy line between having fun and getting caught. Eventually, we reached the base of a roller coaster. Up close, it was laughably massive, a straight, dizzying line of steel clawing the sky. A maintenance stairway ran along the side. Without hesitating, we set our feet on the metal treads, which gave a soft clang-clang, and tried to hold our breath. Some sections had no handrail at all. Cold steel beaded with dew, the carnival city shrinking below our feet like a map that smelled of popcorn and rust. At the top, the wind slashed across our faces like a thin blade. The view snapped open. The whole park lay cupped below, the Ferris wheels silent as a stopped clock. Game booths casting long dark strips, pathways curving like veins. We took one photo, just one. We didn't dare keep the screen lit. Then we exchanged a quick nod. That's enough. Crazy has its limit. On the way down, my pulse wasn't hammering in my throat anymore. My legs had stopped shaking. The route back seemed faster. Maybe the patrol had rotated. Maybe our eyes had learned the dark. About 5 minutes from the fence, a golf cart lumbered into the lane. We flattened ourselves behind a snack stand, its black window glass throwing back the shapes of two jittering kids. The engine grew louder. The headlight washed over the edge of my shoe, then slid on. Just as I was about to exhale, something flicked across the darkness between two buildings. At first, I blamed the headlight glancing off a sign. Then Mason clamped my wrist and pointed exactly there, saying nothing. I squinted. Maybe 30 feet away, someone else was there. Hunched like us, tucked into the shadows like a cat learning to be human. Not a kid. Worst of all, I could feel the gaze, locked on us. We didn't move, not out of good sense, but because we'd frozen. The patrol cart hadn't come back down that lane yet. The figure shot across an open gap and slipped into a wash of sickly yellow streetlight. Only a heartbeat, but enough. A man, clothes in tatters, gait crooked, as if one leg were dragging some invisible weight. His face was smeared with something dark, like dried blood slathered on. He didn't blink. Then he slid out of the light and swallowed himself in the dark on the far side of the kiosk. I glanced at Mason. We had the same thought, raw as the hiss in our chests. Run. But we didn't dare. Only when the golf cart rolled past and that white beam skimmed by did we scurry like rats, hugging our original route, heads ducked so low our necks burned. At the fence, we climbed out at the same spot we'd used to get in and dropped onto the grass on the campground side. Neither of us laughed. All I could think about was the tent, the zipper, the thin skin of fabric that suddenly sounded like safety. Mason looked at me, and I knew his head held only two words too. Back to tent. Once there, we didn't mention sleep. Curled in our bags, we tried to cram what we'd just seen into some reasonable mold. The thinnest, easiest answer to swallow was, a homeless guy doing weird stuff. Stupid, I know, but a 17-year-old brain wants answers that don't bite back. Morning made everything look normal. We ate something quick, planning to go fishing to give the trip some camping color. Around 10, a campground staffer made the rounds to each tent, voice strung tight as wire. The announcement the whole site had to hear. Last night, at a lake about 4 miles away, a man had been stabbed to death. The suspect was still at large. The sheriff's office had asked all rangers and staff within a certain radius to be on high alert. They read the description: white male, disheveled, late 30s, possibly shirtless, bleeding or with blood on his clothing. Then they told everyone to pack up and leave the campground for safety. Mason and I connected the dots instantly. The description was a carbon copy of the man we'd seen. I swallowed hard, a safety pin of cold shooting straight down my nape. We said nothing. Not to my dad, not to the Rangers. I know people will criticize that choice, and they're right. But at that age, the only thing I feared more than a killer was trouble. The explanations, my dad's look, the chance of getting chewed out for sneaking into the park. Years later, I still blame myself for staying quiet. Maybe my statement could have helped catch a dangerous man before he did the next terrible thing. Mason and I are still close. We went to the same college, graduated the same year, took different jobs, but in fields not far apart. Cedar Hollow is something we rarely mention. Honestly, I think Mason feels even more guilty than I do. At some meetups, he'll run a finger around the rim of his glass like he's touching the metal steps from that night. Eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder, where that strip of yellow light tore the darkness into a brief, blinding line. Sometimes, when I hear a tram hum past a mall or see a Ferris wheel rising above a row of town roofs, the feeling from that night comes back. The thin boundary between a sneaking around game and a crime in motion, between the thrill of youth and the guilty quiet of adulthood. I think about distance. Just a few footsteps in a darkened amusement park, between two buildings, where a man who shouldn't have been there painted his face with shadow. We'd gotten close enough to watch him cut through the beam, close enough to see the dark stuff on his face flash like blood, and then too far to save anyone at the exact moment it mattered. I don't hate camping as much as I used to, but I've learned the forest isn't as frightening as what's out of place. An amusement park sprouting beside a campground, a man lurking in a corner, sinking to your heartbeat. A silent decision that seems harmless and stretches into years of haunting. If I could go back to that night, I'd want to see myself take Mason's hand, step out of the tent in the morning, find a ranger, and tell everything. I don't have that chance. Instead, I have a story, and a gap where its ending should have been a statement. I don't want to imagine what would have happened if we'd actually come face to face that night. October 2016. Right when the whole country was feverish about those weird killer clowns, every news segment was flooded with clowns lurking and menacing people. Most of it was obviously for clicks, but as you know, a few incidents weren't jokes. My story is one of the few. I was 16, a junior. After 7th period, I waved goodbye to my friends and hopped on the northbound Red Line in Chicago. The car was unusually empty, not unheard of, but enough that you'd notice if you weren't. Wearing headphones, blasting Drake at full volume, and glued to chemistry flashcards on your phone like I was. In other words, My vigilance radar was basically off. I was too familiar with the area and got complacent. The plan was simple. Get off at Belmont, walk a few blocks, and I'd be home. A normal Wednesday afternoon, everything slid downhill terrifyingly fast. The train braked, the speaker crackled, Belmont. I popped up on autopilot, hardly looking up. Music still on, flashcards still up. I walked straight to the door. The doors hissed open, and something bright blocked the threshold at the edge of my vision. I looked up. A clown was standing in the doorway. He was fully decked out, oversized rainbow pants, a baggy yellow shirt with red suspenders, giant red shoes, a face smeared with chalky white makeup gone blotchy. Red nose, blue eyebrows, a cartoon nightmare standing upright. Only the wig was missing. I froze like a switch had flipped, not just from surprise, but because I'd never been that close to something so bizarre. He didn't speak. He had no intention of boarding. He just stood there blocking the doors, as if this stop belonged to him. In my head, doors close in 5 seconds. Do something. I angled my body to slip past, and right as my shoulder brushed his sleeve, he dipped down smoothly to a creepy, low crouch, like he was deliberately bringing his face level with mine. The white paint was peeling at the corner of his mouth. Underneath was skin a waxy, ashy gray. I jerked away and shot through before he could grab me. He lunged forward, not the clumsy pratfall of a stage clown, but a raw, grappling move. I dodged. My legs switched to a sprint on their own. He chased. The music in my ears became the thud of my heart. No one was in the concourse at that early afternoon hour. Belmont Station was so empty the footsteps on tile echoed like inside an empty pool. I glanced back. The clown was charging, but his stride was oddly offbeat, limbs jerking like his joints were misassembled. What chilled me more than anything was what he had in his hand. A kitchen knife, broad-bladed, the edge a dull gleam like a metal tongue half-licked. Where had he hidden it? What did he plan to do? I had no room for those questions. I bolted up the stairs, each pounding step like ticking off a countdown. The surface air slapped my face, raw, cold, gasoline mingled with old rain. I burst outside, threw myself into the thin flow of people on the sidewalk, and thumbed 911 on autopilot. There's a man dressed as a clown chasing me in the station. He has a knife. Belmont, red line. I rattled it out in one breath, my throat dry as bone. He didn't follow me up to the street. I was still shaking like I'd just surfaced from cold water. The police said they'd send officers down to the station. They asked for a description, asked which way he ran. By the time they arrived, he had dissolved into the concourse and tracks as if he'd never been there. One officer told me gently that I was safe, that the whole city was tired of the clown panic, that most of it was pranks taken too far. I nodded to get it over with, but my mind refused to cooperate. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the irrational thought that somehow he knew where I lived, that one evening, as I took off my headphones at my front door, I'd see a flash of rainbow pants at the bottom of the steps. Of course, that didn't happen. In fact, nothing else happened at all. Maybe my incident flickered across a quick news segment on TV and then sank into the heap of 2016 cases. I'm not sure. I avoided any broadcast that had the word clown for a while. It took a few weeks before my heart stopped spiking every time the train braked into a station, every time someone stood a little too close to the doors. This isn't a textbook ghost story. No haunted house, no whispers from the walls, just an empty corridor, a garish costume, a kitchen knife, and that moment you get cast as the main character without anyone asking your permission. I swear this much. If the train doors had closed 3 seconds earlier that day, if I'd stumbled on the stairs, if I'd turned my head for 1 beat longer, this story might not have anyone left to sit here and tell it. When it started, I was only 2 years out of college. Technically, I was working on an online graduate certificate from the same school that had granted my bachelor's degree. But the loose schedule left me with long, dragging stretches of empty time. I hopped jobs like riding waves. Anything that could fill the hours and stuff a few extra bills into my wallet was worth a try. Indeed was pretty much my only close friend during that period. 90% of my leads came straight from that site. Driving DoorDash in circles around a few neighborhoods in El Paso, Texas, had gotten old. Minimum wage couldn't keep up with gas prices, so I decided to switch things up. That night, in the stream of lifeless listings, one line made my hand stop scrolling. Lifeguard for a private pool at a hotel in a town a few dozen minutes drive from El Paso. Nothing odd at first glance, but 2 details in the post made my throat catch. First, the schedule was flipped. They needed someone to operate and supervise the pool from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m., a bona fide night shift for a pool. Second, and far stranger, preference for applicants who do not speak Spanish. I repeated it in my head slowly, like I was reading a curse. A place where nearly half the residents speak Spanish wanted to hire someone who didn't understand it. The thing was, I'd spoken Spanish since I was a kid. My mom is from Chihuahua. Half of me carries a Mexican surname. The listing sounded nonsensical, even smelled like a lie. But the number at the end did not. $30 an hour. At that moment in my life, touching $30 an hour felt like stubbing my toe on a bar of gold buried under the sand. I decided to ignore everything else that rang false and pretend I didn't know Spanish. What were they going to do to me? Resume sent, and in less than a few hours, an email lit up. Interview the very next afternoon. The job was clearly new, or so applicants starved it was growing mold. On day 1, I drove to the Las Fronteras Hotel, a block of concrete wrapped in glass right off the highway, with a parking lot out back stained with oil blotches. The lobby smelled like new carpet glue mixed with cheap coffee. A middle-aged Mexican guy with a belly and an easy smile came out to greet me. He spoke accented English, asked a few throwaway questions, cracked just enough jokes to snap a stranger's guard. I could hear myself relaxing to his expansive hand gestures while still keeping a sliver of suspicion in my pocket. We were just turning down the hallway toward the pool area when a tall guy appeared from the bend. He stopped and stared at me longer than manners allow. No hello, no smile. He walked straight up and opened his mouth in Spanish. A few lines about the weather, about how the desert wind would shift tonight. No real content, just a stick poked into an anthill. I understood every word, but kept my eyes completely blank, my face truly dumb. The belly-heavy guy, the one who'd greeted me, shot the tall guy a glance. And then the two of them burst out laughing like they'd just pulled off a childish prank. The tall guy held out his hand. "Morales?" he said. "Just kidding. This is Rivas." He jerked his chin toward the paunchy one. "He'll show you around." I gave a stiff smile. There was something cold behind their laughter, like a soda can left too long in the freezer. Faintly sweet, but tongue-numbing. Las Fronteras' pool sat inside a glass-domed complex, LED lights washing the water in a fake-looking blue. The lifeguard chair stood right at the edge. Behind it, against the wall, was a low building with a steel door. Morales called it the pool house, He said the job was simple. Be on duty from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m., rescue if needed, collect money from non-guests who wanted to use the pool, and if there was any problem, call him directly. I asked lightly, letting outside guests use the pool, is that legal? Morales smirked. We have permits. He said it like a man who'd practiced answering that question hundreds of times, the tone stripped of all feeling. Oh, and one more thing. Rivas slipped in, as if casually. If anyone's wearing a blue wristband, you open the pool house door for them. That's it. I didn't ask further. I didn't want to hear an answer I suspected I wouldn't be able to forget. The first week was easy. In fact, the first few weeks were all like that. More customers came than I expected. Lots of local families bringing their kids, chattering and laughing. I took their money, kept watch, squeeged the wet floor with an old mop. No one flashed a blue wristband. I started to believe I'd been overthinking it. Until a Friday evening about a month in, a burly Hispanic guy in a crisp white shirt and oversized sunglasses covering half his face strode up. Without a word, he lifted his wrist. Blue band. I went to the steel door, beeped the key card. The lock released. He vanished inside. About an hour later, he came out and headed straight for the exit. The backpack on his shoulders looked more stuffed than when he'd arrived. I didn't have to interact any further. The door locked itself behind him. Everything flowed like water. I watched and felt my stomach sink. In the weeks that followed, blue wristbands showed up more often. Some days they arrived in groups. At the same time, non-guest usage of the pool spiked, and the money I collected started getting odd. Some people overpaid by nonsensical amounts, as if they wanted to leave behind tidy little overages. I called Morales, stammering that the books would be off. He cut me off. Don't worry about it. People pay wrong all the time. Then he hung up. The dial tone thudded in my ear and smothered every other sound around the pool. In that moment, a single thought surfaced. Simple and murky. Money laundering. I sat still in the lifeguard chair, staring at the water as flat as a sheet of glossy film, and understood that behind that steel door, in the pool house, something else was going on. The metallic and plastic smell of it seeped through the gap just enough for me to recognize it, but not enough to name it. I kept working. The tips thickened, the wristband guys grew buddy-buddy with me, called me by name as they passed, high-fived, pressed neatly folded bills into my palm. I was like a post in a stage play whose director didn't want me to understand the script. Then one evening, there was an incident in the deep end. A kid, not even 10, slipped off his float and started flailing. I jumped straight in, hauled him up, set him on the edge of the pool, patted his back until he coughed the water out. Applause burst around us. Wet faces and the blue lights danced in my eyes. That feeling, doing the right thing in a place full of wrong, was sweet enough to hurt my teeth. A few minutes later, Morales appeared as if out of the ground. He shook my hand, squeezing tight, his eyes warm in a way that felt genuinely rare. You saved my life. I hadn't yet understood when he added, that boy is my son. The next morning, Morales, Rivas, and a few of the wristband guys were already waiting at the pool gate, each with a glass of amber liquor. They celebrated. Glasses clinked. One guy raised his drink and gave a toast in Spanish. I remember the cadence more than the exact words. He honored the pile of money pouring in. And then, as if it were nothing, he mentioned the lives we're ruining. Everyone laughed. The liquor was drained. In that laughter, I saw a black stain spreading across the blue surface of the pool. I lied to myself that my hands were still clean. I'd been hired to do a job, and I was doing that job. That lie carried me for a few days, until my mother's phone call buzzed on my thigh during my shift. My mother only speaks Spanish. She only calls when it's truly important. I climbed down from the chair and stepped into a tucked-away corner where the glass walls met, thinking I'd have a bit of privacy. I answered softly, "Ma, I'm here." I don't remember why she called. What I remember vividly is that when I hung up and turned back into the hallway, Rivas was standing there blocking the way. The look in his eyes was no longer that of an affable, pot-bellied guy. In a silence thick as boiler room steam, he asked, "Since when do you know Spanish?" I gave a dumb smile and said I was practicing with a friend, that I wanted to learn. He didn't believe me. He didn't need to say so. I could see it. His pupils tightened, as if weighing an option his hands could carry out very quickly. My heart pounded in my throat. The only way out behind me was water. "Fine," he said at last, like tossing a coin. Then he turned and walked into the pool house. I sat frozen on the chair, knowing that if I stood up and left right then, I'd be signing a confession with my own body. That moment stretched out like a stormy night. The pool suddenly sounded like ice. A few minutes before my shift ended, Rivas came back and told me to show up an hour early the next day. He had a new opportunity to propose. Before turning away, he stuffed a wad of cash into my hand, soft, thick, smelling of sweat and cheap cologne. "Tips," he said. That night, I never went back to Las Fronteras. Not a chance. I turned off my phone and left the parking lot without checking the mirror. I don't think I was followed home. But for months afterward, any van parked too long at a corner made me flinch. Any unfamiliar eyes in a grocery store made me think of a steel door with no handle on the outside. Some nights I lay awake, hearing the air conditioner hum like Morales' voice booming in my head. I don't know why they needed me. Drug trafficking? That was too obvious to pretend otherwise. Money laundering? I'd seen how those overpayments stacked up. But why have a supposedly innocent lifeguard standing in the middle of the pool? A name on payroll? A face to point to if anyone asked? Maybe just to pretty up the paperwork if the police dropped by. Maybe just to gag me with tip money when necessary. I know only one thing. In the instant, Rivas looked straight through me. After he'd heard me speaking Spanish to my mother, there was only one option in his mind. I saw that option pass through his pupils like a shadow. I had stood very close to an ending that, had I fallen into it, would have left no one to tell this story. Years have passed, but the smell of chlorine sometimes drags me back to that pool night. The jittering green-blue LEDs, the steel door easing shut, a child coughing water into my hands, and a toast in Spanish. Money pouring in. Lives being ruined. Among those lives, I eventually understood, more slowly than I'd like, that the first life I had to save wasn't that child's. It was my own.
I see.